Welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games. Today we continue my top 100 board games of all time. Last time we covered games numbers 50 through 41. Today we're going to be covering games numbers 40 through 31. So without any further ado, let's get straight to the list. My number 40 board game of all time is Imperial Settlers. And this is a civilization themed game. The base game comes with 4 civilizations. I believe it's Rome, Greece, Egypt, and Japan. There are expansions that add additional civilizations like the Atlanteans. This is a card-based civilization-themed game where players are playing cards in their tableau, in their player area, that will advance their civilization. They're playing cards that are going to produce food for them. You have to feed your civilization. They're playing down buildings. They're going to produce different resources for them, such as stone. They are playing attack cards so that they can militarily attack their opponents around the table and bring harm to their civilizations. Really cool game, really simplistic implementation of the civilization theme. There are a lot of games that are much more heavy and complex and grandiose when it comes to this style or this genre of game. But this here keeps it short, it keeps it simplistic, and it's simply card-based, and I do enjoy a good, simple card game. My number 40 board game of all time, Imperial Settlers. Now we move on to my number 39 game of all time, and that is Dice Town. And this is a Wild West game designed by Ludovic Mablanc and Bruno Cathala. And basically players are playing games of poker, but with dice. You have these 6-sided dice that each side of the die corresponds with a different suit or a different card type within your typical 52 card deck. You got jacks, you got queens, you got aces, you got kings, and you've got 6 different sections on the board. And in each of those sections, there's a particular reward for whoever wins the poker hand there. And each of them are triggered by having the most of these different types of cards, your jacks, your queens, your kings, and your aces. And you're trying to do this, and ultimately all of this is going to get you victory points to be the winner of the game. There's also a little bit of a city building feel where you got all these different buildings that generate victory points for you that players are also playing. Whoever has the best overall poker hand at the end of each round will earn one of these buildings. So if you have a full house, or if you have 3 of a kind, 4 of a kind, you will be rewarded accordingly. It really brings out the Wild West feel of it. I love the dice rolling. It comes with these big bullet-shaped cups that you use to roll your dice, and you reveal it all at the same time, see what you have. Really cool. My number 39 board game of all time, Dice Town. Now we move on to my number 38. My number 38 board game of all time is Port Royal. This is a pirate-themed press your luck game where players are drawing cards from a deck one at a time, deciding if they want to continue going further and drawing more cards, or will they accept what they already have. And basically, you've got all these cards that are going to produce money for you because they have different ships that bring a certain amount of money, or I guess you're pirates and you're robbing the money, or I think the ships represent the pirates. But the point is, these different ships have different colored banners corresponding with the different nations that they represent. And as you flip over a card, you're hoping that you do not flip over another ship of the same banner or of the same color. Because once you flip over 2 ships of the same color, your turn is done. You've busted. You will move on to the next player. However, if you keep on pulling cards and you draft cards of different banners, different colors, and I believe there's 5 different colors in the deck, then you can continue going. And the more ships there are, each ship has a different value of how much money it'll produce for you. But the more ships there are, by the time you decide to call it quits, the more money you will generate. And that money is going to be used to purchase or acquire different character cards. And the character cards will give you in-game abilities, but ultimately they will also give you victory points for the end of the game, because the first player to accrue 12 victory points will be the winner. Fun game. It's always enjoyable when you can play this press your luck type of game, but at the same time feel like there's strategy and long-term game planning, and it's not just deciding at a whim whether or not you want to test your fate here. Really cool. My number 38 board game of all time, Port Royal. Now we move on to my number 37 board game of all time, and that is Batman Gotham City Under Siege. And this is a Batman the Animated Series themed game by IDW. And this game here is a cooperative game, simple game, but the interesting part of this game is the three-dimensional element to it, because you do have these cardboard-shaped buildings that represent the buildings in Gotham City, and you set them up in a 3x3 grid, and the villains are basically attacking the city from all ends, right? There's 4 sides of the city, and from all ends, the villains are attacking. And you and your teammates, controlling different characters like Batman and Robin and Catwoman and Commissioner Gordon, you guys are all trying to tackle all these different problems all across the city. Here's the thing. As you maneuver around the city, one of the options you have is to go on the rooftops to not only make it to the other side quicker, but also from the rooftop, you have the advantage that you can kind of take care of all 4 sides at a time. So that's something really cool, really thematic. If you're on one side of the street, you can only cover or take care of the villains that are on that side of the street. But if you're in the rooftop, you have the vantage point and you can take care of the villains from all angles. And you got Joker and Two-Face and Bane and all the typical rogues gallery of villains that Batman is known for. Really fun. It's a dice placement game where you're rolling dice. You're also playing some cards that trigger particular actions, and each different hero has their own set of cards with their own unique actions. But they also have their own little player board where they also have unique abilities to them, where you're rolling dice, and based on the dice you roll, you place them on the particular slots, and you will trigger these powers. And knowing which powers are most efficient, most economic, and most practical to that current circumstance is the key to this game. Also, being able to roll the die that you need at the particular time is also crucial to this game, but there are some opportunities for dice manipulation as well. Really cool, really thematic. I like the three-dimensional feel to it with the 3D buildings. I like the miniatures that move around the city. The villains are not represented by miniatures. They're represented by squared tokens. But hey, at least the heroes are. My number 37 board game of all time, Batman the Animated Series, Gotham City Under Siege. Now we move on to my number 36 game of all time, and that is Keyforge. And Keyforge, designed by Richard Garfield of Magic the Gathering fame. I already talked about Magic much earlier on the list. Here, this game is going to take over Magic for me. It's from Fantasy Flight, but it's not part of their LCG model. It's almost like a hybrid between LCG and collectible card game, although probably more on the collectible card game. And I'm not sure. I don't think Fantasy Flight has this game in their rights anymore. I think Richard Garfield and the other developers, designers have moved on to greener pastures, but they produced a lot of content for it. And the interesting thing is that each time you bought a deck, they came with pre-made decks that were ready to play. But each deck was unique to itself, and you did not know what deck you were buying. It's not like you were like, oh, let me buy such and such deck. You just bought a deck, you opened it up, and they would tell you the name of the deck and the composition of the deck. And basically, each deck, there's several factions in each set. And within those factions, each individual deck is going to consist of 3 factions and cards from within those 3 factions. And the different configurations, there's some sort of computer-generated system that's actually deciding which decks will have which cards. But it's really cool just opening up a deck, playing it. Every base set comes with 2 standard decks that's the same from set to set. But from that point forward, every individual deck you buy will be completely unique to you. My number 36 board game of all time, Keyforge. Now we move on to my number 35 game of all time, and that is Heroscape. In particular, the Marvel rendition. This game, Heroscape, came out in the early 2000s. It was all the rage back then. It was these large hexagonal tiles that you would use, 3-dimensional, to plastic. They weren't cardboard. And you would use them and stack them upon one another and create all these interesting different terrains. You would have elevated terrains. You would have mountains and cliffs and what have you. And you would have different miniatures who would move across this area, this player area, that the players would create. And sometimes there were maps that were designed and pre-made or what have you. But quite often players would just make whatever playing area, whatever map they would want to make. And it's a cool game. I have bought a lot of stuff for it in recent years, different tiles, different terrain types and stuff, so I could build. And in particular, I've gotten into the Marvel side of things. I'm a big Marvel fan. You probably will notice if you look at my backdrop here, you probably have noticed from some of the games that I've already included in my top 100. But I like the comics, I like the animated films or series, I like the MCU and the live action films. Basically, players are moving across. Each character has a different stat. And based on that stat, you know how far they can move, you know how many dice they roll when they attack. Sometimes they have particular abilities that allow them to move more efficiently or to attack more efficiently. Sometimes they have abilities that allow them to defend more efficiently, because you can defend against your opponent's attacks. And basically, you can play to a particular objective or a particular goal, or you could play to one player has eliminated a certain amount of the other player's characters. Really cool, really fun, really thematic. Again, the visual appeal is really satisfying when you see the maps that you build out, and you see your different characters maneuver and move around through those maps. My number 35 board game of all time, Marvel Heroscape. Now we move on to my number 34 game of all time, and it's Pandemic. Quite some time ago, early on the list, I talked about Pandemic the Cure, the dice-based game, which I do like that game. And for some time, I was wrestling with the idea of which game do I like more? Do I like Pandemic the Cure more or Pandemic? But long-term, Pandemic has won out. I am more of a fan of card-based games than dice-based games, so that's for starters. I did appreciate how creative Pandemic the Cure was with re-implementing the game from a dice perspective, but it is a lot harder, and it makes sense because dice games are harder to control, harder to manipulate, even when well designed. Pandemic, classic game. I personally like to play with the In the Lab expansion, with the second expansion or the first expansion. I forgot what it's called, but those are must-haves for me. In the Lab, maybe not so much, but the On the Brink expansion, I believe, is a very important expansion to include because it adds additional special events, it adds additional character roles that I find to be essential, and it adds a couple different game modules to make alternative gaming experiences, right? So all of this makes the expansions must have for me, but even the basic plain base game is still a very good game, especially to introduce new people and get them into it. I appreciate the fact that in the board game world, where so many fiction-based themes drive and inspire the creative design process, to have a game that seems more based on real-world possibilities. Really fun, really cool. My number 34 board game of all time, Pandemic. Now we move on to my number 33 board game of all time, and that is Marvel Zombies. Yet another Marvel-themed game on my list. As I told you, big Marvel fan. And Marvel Zombies is a re-implementation of Zombicide. And in particular, it's based on the Marvel Zombies comic book stories. And this game here has kind of overtaken Zombicide for me. But this game here, with the reskinning of the Marvel theme on the gaming system, it's really cool. You got all the zombies that are coming and taking over, but now some of the heroes have also been zombified, and the non-zombie heroes are trying to not only combat these other zombies, but these powerful superheroes as well. There's different players, different ways of playing the game. You can actually control the zombies, the zombie heroes, and be fighting against the non-zombie heroes. I personally have only played Heroes Resistance, which is kind of like the mass market version that has come out for Marvel Zombies. And in that game, there's only the mode where you are the non-zombie heroes contending with the zombified heroes. It's really cool. You control 4 different characters in the Heroes Resistance game. I think in other iterations, you might have to control all 6, but that's kind of like what Zombicide is all about. No matter what the player count, you always have a certain amount of heroes per scenario that you need. You might need 4, you might need 5, you might need 6. And even if you're just playing solo, you kind of have to control all those characters. So that is a bit of a challenge. I do prefer to play with additional players because I personally do not like controlling multiple characters, especially when it goes beyond 2, because there is a lot of upkeep, there is a lot to keep track of, And I'm not saying it's necessarily hard, but I prefer not to have to keep up with what 4 different characters are doing. I prefer to have 1 or 2 other human players assisting me and helping me with that process. But it's just an enjoyable game. Nice miniatures, nice modular boards that you make up depending on the scenario. Really cool. My number 33 board game of all time, Marvel Zombies. My number 32 board game of all time is Raiders of the North Sea, designed by Shem Phillips. This here is the game that brought Shem Phillips to prominence as a board game designer. From this, the North Sea trilogy truly became known within the industry. We moved on to the West Kingdom trilogy, and now we have the South Tigris trilogy. We have all these different trilogies that are yet to come, probably, from designer Shem Phillips. This here was what started it all. This was a worker placement game. Really cool because you have different types of workers. You have your regular Raiders or your regular Vikings, then you have your upgraded Vikings, and some of the actions later on in the game can only be triggered or activated by those upgraded Vikings, so you want to make sure you get them as soon as possible. Players are looting all these different areas or raiding all these different areas for different types of goods, then they're offering it to their chief priests to get some tiles that are going to get them victory points. Really cool. Sometimes you are sacrificing your crew members. They are dying in the process. They're going to Valhalla. You go up in the Valkyrie track, and that also gives you victory points. Just enjoyable. Viking theme really comes out. The worker placement is very unique and different, distinct from some of the other worker placement games prior to this. My number 32 board game of all time, Raiders of the North Sea. And now for the last game for today's list, my number 31 board game of all time, and that is Marvel Remix. Yet another Marvel themed game. 3 Marvel themed games within the last 5 spots. And Marvel Remix is such a simple game when you think about it, but the possibilities for strategy are endless. It's a simple card game where players start the game with 7 cards in their hand. At the end of their each turn, they have to end with 7 cards in their hand. And at the end of the game, they will still only have 7 cards in their hand. But what's going on each turn from round to round is each player is taking turns drawing a card either from the decks. There's 2 different decks. There's a hero deck and a villain deck, and you do need a hero, at least 1 hero, or at least 1 villain in your hand of 7 cards by the end of the game. If you do not meet this requirement, then you will not even qualify. You will not even be eligible for victory, no matter how many points you have. If you do not have a hero, you could have an ally. That's a different card type that's similar to hero. You need to have either or, but you do need to have 1 villain. If not, don't even count your points. It doesn't matter. But you're drawing a card from one of the respective decks, or there are face-up cards that players are going to be discarding, because when you discard a card, it's going to go into this face-up player area or discard area, and you could pick from those. And the advantage of that is that you see what you're getting. So you could either take a risk and go blind into one of the decks, or you can grab what you see there. You might not like it as much as the potential cards that might be in the decks, but at least you know what you're getting. So that's the simple turn process. You draw a card, you discard a card, and you're going to keep on doing that. And at the end of the game, you're still always going to have 7 cards. And these different cards are going to combo with one another. Each of them intrinsically offer a certain amount of victory points, but they also have some different ways of comboing with each other depending on different icons or symbols that are on each card. And if you get certain icons to match with others, or if you get different pairs or combinations of these different icons, you'll get more points. You also have some cards that tell you that they will penalize you and subtract points from you based on different icons or card types that you might have in your hand. And these are the decisions that you're factoring in your decision-making processes as you're making a choice turn from turn and you're deciding what you want to do. And at the end of the game, you're going to tally up all the points that each of those 7 cards gives you, and whoever has the most points at the end of the game is the winner. Such a fun experience, such a quick game, and it provides such a thought-provoking, challenging experience for a game that is so short, that takes up so little table space, and that's a small card box that can travel with you anywhere you go. Really cool. My number 31 board game of all time, Marvel Remix. And that's it for today's video, folks. Thank you so much for joining us here at When Harry Met Board Games. Please comment down below. Tell me what you thought about this particular set of 10 games. Which games here do you share with me in your pleasure and your joy for them? And which games are you disappointed and appalled at because I would include it on such a high ranked spot on my list? I'm interested in reading what you guys have to say. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.